Okay, so today we're diving into a topic that's, well, it's pretty heavy, but so important to understand. Joint mortgages and how they can become really dangerous in abusive relationships.
Yeah, it's one of those things you don't always think about. Like buying a house, it's supposed to be this positive step, right? But it can become a whole other way for abusers to control someone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there's this article from All About Finance UK that really got me thinking about all of this. It's called Dangers of Joint Mortgages in Abusive Relationships. And it was just published last month, September 15th.
Oh, recent then. I know there's been more and more talk about this lately, which is good. It's important to have these conversations out in the open.
For sure. And what's interesting is this article doesn't just lay out the facts, it tells a real story. A woman named Lauren who went through this.
Stories make it hit home. It's not just theory, it's people's lives.
It really is. We're also going to be weaving in comments from readers who shared their thoughts on the article. We've got Amara, Ricardo, Isaac, Mack. They all brought up different angles, which I always find fascinating.
Yeah, getting those different perspectives is so important.
It is, because it helps us get a more well-rounded view. So in this deep dive, we're not just skimming the surface. We're going to unpack the legal stuff, the societal impact, and most importantly, we're going to talk about what you can do to protect yourself or someone you know.
Absolutely, because knowledge is power in these situations. I mean, it's not just about understanding finances. It's about understanding how power and control work in these really unhealthy ways.
Right, and that's what's so heartbreaking about Lauren's story in the article. She gets out of this abusive relationship, thinks she's free, and then bam, she's hit with this financial nightmare. Turns out her ex-husband had stopped paying the mortgage.
Ugh, classic economic abuse. It's so insidious because it often hides in plain sight. People focus on the physical stuff, which is obviously awful, but the financial control can be just as damaging long term. And sadly, Lauren's situation, it's more common than you think.
It's terrifying how common it is. The article mentioned a survey from Surviving Economic Abuse, and get this one, and 8 women with joint mortgages in the last 2 years said they'd experienced abuse related to it.
1 in 8. That's huge. And honestly, when you consider that economic abuse shows up in something like 95% of domestic violence cases, well, it shows you how big this problem really is.
It's staggering, and it makes you wonder, why? Why is this happening? Like, why isn't there more protection, legally speaking?
Well, that's the tricky part, right? See, the UK's Domestic Violence Act, it does recognize economic abuse as a form of domestic violence. That's good. But
But there's always a but.
there is. So the law says that for things to change with the mortgage, like if you want to separate debts, both people have to agree, even if there's proof of abuse.
Oh, wow. So you're recognized as a victim, but then the system can still trap you.
Exactly. And that's where things get really complicated, legally speaking.
That's so frustrating. It's like what one of the readers, Amara, was saying in the comments. She said it's this Groundhog Day, feeling women stuck because of money. History just repeating itself.
Yeah, and that gets to something really important, the need for broader societal change. Because for so long, women haven't had the same opportunities for financial independence, which makes them more vulnerable to this kind of voice in the first place.
It's like a vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And speaking of history repeating, Amara also made this chilling comparison in her comment. She likened it to that old movie, Gaslight.
The one where the husband manipulates his wife into thinking she's going crazy.
Yes, that's the one. And she's right. There are these eerie parallels to how economic abuse works, making the victim question their reality, their grip on their finances.
Right. And those tactics often work because a lot of people, they aren't that financially literate to begin with. It's
Yeah,
easier to be manipulated when you don't have that solid foundation of knowledge.
totally. And the article actually cited some pretty dismal findings from the Building Societies Association, the BSA. They found that millions of people in the UK have almost no savings whatsoever. And guess what? It's women who are overrepresented in that group.
Not surprising, unfortunately. That's why the BSA's work is so important. Their research shows this clear link between being financially insecure and being vulnerable to economic abuse. It's like this awful cycle. Lack of financial independence makes you more likely to experience this type of abuse, which then makes it even harder to build that security.
It's like a trap that's really hard to get out of.
Yeah.
So with all of this, is there any hope? Like, is there any light at the end of the tunnel?
Well, there's starting to be. The article talks about a push for a cross-government task force to really tackle this whole mortgage-based abuse problem head on.
Okay, that's something. But how much of a difference could a task force really make? And how long would that take to actually see any real change? I mean, are we talking years?
You're right to ask about the timeline. Systemic change, it doesn't happen overnight, that's for sure. But if this task force is done right, if they have the resources and the backing they need, yeah, we could see some positive shifts, maybe in the next 5 to 10 years. It's not a quick fix, but it's a step.
5 to 10 years. That feels like a long time when you're in the thick of it.
It does. It really does. And that's why, alongside this bigger push for change, it's so important to talk about what individuals can do right now because, someone might be listening to this and they're in this situation. What can they do today?
Exactly. So for those listening who might be thinking, this is me, this is my life, what does the article recommend for taking action immediately?
The article, it really stresses reaching out for help as that crucial first step. Like organizations like Surviving Economic Abuse, SEA, and Women's Aid, they're there specifically for this.
Okay, so you're not alone. There are people out there who understand and can help.
Exactly. You don't have to navigate this alone. And it's not just about, the immediate crisis either. These organizations, they can help with long-term planning too.
So getting back on your feet financially, getting that independence back.
Right, because that's a huge part of breaking free from these situations.
Right. It is. Now, besides reaching out, are there other things the article suggests people can do, maybe on their own?
Yeah, one thing they really emphasized was financial literacy. Like, the more you understand about money, the better you're able to spot those red flags, make good decisions, protect yourself.
It's about empowering yourself with that knowledge, right?
Exactly. The article even suggested, taking some online courses, maybe attending a workshop, even just reading a book about personal finance, anything to build up that knowledge base.
It all starts with knowledge. Now, the article also mentions something about setting up a secret savings account. What's the thinking there?
That's about creating a safety net. Even if it's just a little bit, saving consistently over time, it can give you that financial cushion if you need to leave quickly.
That makes a lot of sense. It's about having that escape hatch. Now, I did want to bring in some of those reader comments we mentioned earlier because, like we said, there's so many different perspectives on this. Preston, for example, was wondering about the best ways to educate people about these risks. Like, how do we prevent this from happening in the first place?
That's the million-dollar question, right? And I think it comes down to normalizing conversations about finances, making financial literacy a core part of education, starting young, and then, of course, public awareness campaigns, getting the word out there.
It's about changing the whole conversation around money, making it less taboo.
Right. Because silence, that's what allows these kinds of abuses to thrive.
Now, another reader, Leo Fleming, he brought up something really interesting. He connected this whole issue to other societal challenges we're seeing. Like he mentioned the debate about obesity jabs and how socioeconomic factors influence health outcomes.
Oh, I see where he's going with that. It's about how deeply interconnected these issues are. Poverty, lack of access to healthcare, economic abuse. They're all symptoms of these larger systemic problems.
We tend to compartmentalize things, but it's all related in the end. Now, we also had Alyssa, who was pretty vocal about what she sees as government inaction on this. She says awareness campaigns aren't enough, that we need a complete cultural shift.
And she's not wrong. Awareness is a start, but it's not the finish line. We need to fundamentally change how we think about power, control, gender roles and relationships, and that takes a sustained, multifaceted approach.
It's a tall order. Jordan, another reader, made a similar point that this really requires a collective effort, a real societal shift. Do you think such a fundamental change is actually possible, though? I mean, it can feel pretty overwhelming.
It does, and it's definitely not easy, but possible. Yeah, I do believe it's possible. It takes individuals speaking up, communities coming together, and institutions changing from the inside out.
So it's got to be this multi-pronged approach happening on all these different levels.
Exactly. And that's what I liked about Isaac's comment. Remember him? He was the one who really dove into the legal reform aspect.
Right. He was all about changing the laws.
He was, and rightfully so. But then he added this crucial point that awareness and legal changes, they're not enough on their own. We need to have real, tangible support systems in place for survivors.
Yeah, support that goes beyond just knowing about the problem, right? It's about having resources that actually help survivors rebuild their lives.
So what would those support systems look like? Can you give us some concrete examples?
Sure. Isaac mentioned a few, like financial counseling would be huge, right? Helping people make a plan, get back on their feet, and educational programs, maybe even job training that's specifically designed for survivors of economic abuse.
It's about giving people the tools to become financially independent again.
Exactly. It's not just about surviving, it's about thriving.
Exactly. Now, did Isaac bring up anything else that stood out to you? He did. He touched on something that's so important, and it's this idea of an intersectional approach. We've talked about, the socioeconomic factors involved, but Isaac's point was that we can't forget about things like race, religion, sexual orientation, disability. All of these things intersect with economic abuse.
Creating even more vulnerability for certain groups.
Exactly. So the solutions, they can't be one size fits all. We need resources that are tailored to those different needs and experiences.
Making sure everyone has the support they need no matter their background.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone's experience is unique.
This has been a deep dive in every sense of the word. We've covered so much ground today, from Lauren's story, which is heartbreaking, to this bigger picture of economic abuse and how it plays out in these really damaging ways. And it's clear, it's not just about mortgages, it's about power and control, and a system that often fails to protect the people who need it most.
It's tough to face, but the more we talk about it, the better equipped we are to create change. And like we said, there is hope. There are things individuals can do to protect themselves, and there are amazing organizations doing incredible work to support survivors.
Knowledge is power, right?
100%. Even just understanding the dynamics at play, that's a huge step.
Absolutely. So on that note, we want to leave you with something to think about, a question inspired by Isaac's comment about support systems. If you were to design one resource specifically for survivors of economic abuse, what would it be and why?
It's a big question, but an important one.
It is. Thank you for joining us for this conversation. It's been real. And until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep asking those tough questions.